The Maplewood City Council Manager Workshop for Monday, August 26. Ms. Coleman, would you do the roll call, please?
Absolutely. Councilmember Neblett.
Here.
Councilmember Smith.
Here.
Councilmember Knutson.
Here.
Acting Mayor Juniman.
Here.
And note that our Mayor Abrams is out of town today.
Next, I'm looking for a motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Neblett, seconded by Smith to approve the agenda. Any other discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion obviously passes. Unfinished business. Oh, my goodness. The suspense is almost over.
Not quite.
Not quite. Okay. Unfinished business, City Manager's Budget Workshop number 2. City Manager Coleman, you want to
Sure.
tee this up?
Thank you, Acting Mayor Juniman, members of the City Council. Tonight, Ms. Paulseth is going to go again over some of the budget, but most specifically, she's going to talk to you about some information that we received from Ramsey County right after our last meeting, actually, on the proposed market values and tax capacities for 2020. And so we did have a really big home value increase. Median home value in Maplewood increased by 10.5% for taxes payable next year to $245,400 for the median home. So it was interesting. Ellie was telling me that there basically are no more $100,000 homes in Ramsey County. They're very rare. So if you're trying to sell your house, that's really great news, but when it comes time to pay the taxes, it's not so much. And this goes up and down every year, where we just sit and wait to see who's going to get the increases, whether it be commercial or industrial or residential or what type of residential. And the county isn't really, they like to keep us in suspense. So Ms. Paulthus is going to talk about that and then go over just some of the bigger points of the budget, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have about the levy that we're proposing for next year. That, Mayor?
Ms. Paulseth. I have a question. It's probably the $64,000 question that has no answer, but do we have a Reader's Digest condensed form answer to how do they determine this? Besides throw things up in the air, whatever lands first is what they do.
Acting Mayor and Council, you're asking how do they determine the market values?
Yeah, what goes up and what goes down.
You know, actually, they do have a process, and there is a law that requires that the county assessor to value all homes within a certain percentage of the market. And so they have to do sales ratio studies in the market as to what's actually going on in the market. And the market is really tight right now, and home values are very high, so they have to follow that. I expect that there will be a correction at some point here, but unfortunately, they're following the market.
Okay.
Well, and
Thank you.
If I could just add to that.
Certainly.
We have seen residential values go down.
Yes.
You know, when we had the recession,
Yep.
things were going down, and now they're kind of ratcheting back up.
Right.
So there are cycles, and as Ellie said, we really don't have much control over.
Yeah, I know we don't have control, and I also always say to people, it's just as much a mystery to us as it is to you exactly where they find this. I mean, I get what you just said, but sometimes you wonder. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you, Acting Mayor. And I don't know if this is Ms. Paulseth or Ms. Coleman, but could you maybe share if there are people kind of tuning in or listening? There is a process for contesting your evaluation. And I do know of a few residents I've spoken with who've had some success through that process. And I think the county's pretty open to revisiting things. How does someone go about doing that?
Acting Mayor and Council, that process happens every year, but it does happen earlier in the year. So for residents, they would need to, in March, attend the evaluation meetings and file their petition there. So it really is too late, unless you're going to tax court. It's too late to contest your valuation at this point.
But for next year?
But for next year, yeah, you can watch it.
Okay, thank you.
May I
Continue, please.
proceed? Okay, thank you. As Ms. Coleman said, we're going to talk a little bit more about the budget, but as we receive information, we're processing it as quickly as possible. That's kind of how this process works. We've got more information from the county now. It's not final information. It'll keep changing until the end of the year. But it's the best that we have, and it's pretty accurate for what we're estimating at this point. So tonight, we're mostly going to talk about property taxes. We're going to show you what the impact of your levy will be on residents' property taxes, and talk a little bit about the macro environment and what else is factoring in. And we've already alluded to the market values. Quickly, we'll talk about a couple of revisions that we'll be making to the CIP before year end, and talk a little bit about utility fund transfers to the general fund. We want to keep kind of that on the, since it's been an issue in the past, we want to keep that on the agenda each year so that you have a review of that. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're going to tweak the financial policies. So as staff, we are still recommending a 5% levy increase. We haven't backed off of that recommendation. There's a number of reasons that we'll go over. Obviously, it will provide us the capacity to manage some of the challenges that we're looking at now, and give us a better chance to manage the future challenges if we build the capacity into our levy. One of the things that surprised everyone is that the legislature did not enact levy limits when local government aid was raised. So if the legislature happens to decide to do that, next year we would be in a little bit of trouble if we didn't set ourselves up appropriately this year with our levy, and we would not even be able to meet our contractual obligations with the labor unions. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about the increase in tax petitions. So an awful lot of commercial property. We're seeing higher petitions than last year even, and we had significant amount of tax dollars that were petitioned and abated last year. And we really need to start thinking about whether this is a long-term trend and how we're going to budget for this. Again, 5% is an increase of 1.1 million. A couple of things to point out. The debt service funds were reduced by 263,000 because debt is being paid down. We turn that around and put it into our capital project and building funds. So we're trying to, as debt gets paid down, we're going to a pay-as-you-go basis on our facilities and equipment. The general fund looks considerably higher than it really is because, as you remember, we folded the recreation fund back into the general levy. So you're seeing a $200,000 reduction in the recreation fund and an increase in the general fund. That was an important part of fixing a problem in that area. We weren't able to get everything done with the 5%. Rarely does that ever happen, that we get everything that we're asking for. Just another reason for us to, build up that capacity for next year, because we really want to try to stay at 3% next year. The police department still feels strongly that they will need a rental housing police officer. We've only accommodated for 1 month, so the month of December we would be hiring, and we'll need to manage to fit the remainder of that position in next year's. We don't know yet at this point if we'll need increased administrative costs for the rental housing program. Keep in mind that at this point, the fees from the budgeted fees from the rental housing program are $40,000 more than the expenses. So the general fund is actually leaning on the rental housing program for this first year, and we want to correct that next year. It's another reason why we don't want to cut things too short. We have to take care of that recreation fund deficit. We'll talk more about that later. We have some other ideas, and we're always looking at needing to increase our equipment levies and our fund balance reserved. And we really need to talk seriously about reserving more for the uncollectible taxes if the trend continues. The county talked to me specifically about a very large property in the city with a very large petition. They're hiring a specific appraiser to appraise that type of property, and so they are trying to fight the petition, but really won't know probably until the end of the year, maybe not even then. And so it could impact our next year's tax collections considerably. And finally, we do want to be able to build in some capacity to raise the EDA levy. So the 5% will really help get started on some of these things as well as take care of the current needs for 2020. As I mentioned, the county gave us information that tax petitions are continuing to increase. As you can see in this chart, they were kind of at an all-time high, and then, during the recession, they leveled off, and they're starting to increase again. And so the amount of petitions are considerably more than last year. Last year, the city was hit with $750,000 in petitions, and that was not all property taxes. Some of it was tax increment, but about $500,000 of it affected the general fund. Actually, a little more. We were lucky enough to have excellent building permit revenues last year, or in 2018. And we also were fortunate enough that the department heads all got together and everybody kind of put a hold on spending, and so we were able to weather that pretty well and still have a surplus at the end of the year. We don't know that can happen every year. It really depends on the variables. A $750,000 reduction in tax revenue is pretty significant even in 1 year. If it should happen again, that is a pretty big problem to have, and the county is warning us that it could. So leading into that, notwithstanding any additional petitions, we always expect at least $250,000, so we really didn't expect $750,000 last year and really aren't quite prepared for it this year. And neither is the fund balance. We're estimating that we're going to end the year in 2019 at above our minimum target of 41.67, or 5 months of expenditures. But by the end of 2020, we will be right back down to the bare minimum again. And part of that is because the general fund is absorbing the recreation fund, which had no fund balance. And in fact, there was a negative $350,000 to $400,000. So that was actually a bigger problem. And rather than having a reserve, there was a deficit. So we're kind of buying down the reserve by absorbing that levy deficit and barely hanging on. And in these projections, we are projecting a $200,000 surplus, levy surplus, to be levied and put into the surplus in each of these years after 2020. So that just shows you how difficult it is as expenditures rise to keep the cash flow that you need. So we really need to be aware of that and cognizant of that. And the 5% will just set us up better to manage that in the future. So what we're all interested in, the property tax impact of the preliminary levy that we're talking about, the 5%. So in red, you'll see what the county is calling the median value home is raised from $222,000 to $245,000, so 10.5%. So what that means is about 11.5% increase in city taxes. So that's $107 of an increase for city taxes alone. So we know that's considerable. There are a number of other market value classifications as well, but I'm concentrating on the median value right now, and just to show you the impact of what we originally had talked about, a 4.5% increase. The difference it would be a $7 savings to the average or the median homeowner. So I realize $7 is significant for some people, but what we're looking at here is weighing out some of these, balancing some of these needs that the city has right now against the $7. Just a quick review of where the levy's been. It's been anywhere in the last 7, 8 years, from 0% to 5%, couple fives in there. Overall, average of all those years was 3.3. Hopefully, we're back at 3 next year. I will say that in 2017, again, the problem there was fund balance. Our fund balance was right down to the bare minimum. And in order to keep up with it, we had to go with a 5 to keep it up there. So we really would rather, keep it more consistent. I will say, though, that 3% is difficult when your labor contracts are 3% and you have 70% or 78% of your levy is labor. It is difficult to stay under 3 when you have other benefit and wage expenses as well that are rising. So we're doing our very best to keep it at 3 through the years, but there have been occasions when we simply haven't been able to do that. The good news is that the tax capacity continues to rise. Average annual increase over the past 7 years is 5.8%. It's just a good sign that, the economy, the local economy is improving. And another good sign is we saw a fairly significant increase in our fiscal disparities distribution this year. I was waiting with bated breath, as I always do, to get that number. It slightly lowered last year, and this year it rose by something like 144,000, I believe, up to 3.1 million. So before I talk about that, I'll talk just a little bit about what fiscal disparities is, in case some of the members or some of the folks at home aren't familiar with that. It's implemented by the Metropolitan Council, and it's a regional approach to solving infrastructure problems in the metropolitan area. It's been running about the same since the late 1960s when it was developed. It hasn't changed a whole lot. And what it really is a cost-sharing approach. So what happens is the commercial industrial property values in the entire metro area are put into a pool. And it's actually Anoka County that administers that pool. And then all of those values then get redistributed in a more equitable way through a formula to all of the metropolitan cities. So Maplewood likes this because we gain from it. We gain $3.1 million. What that means is that $3.1 million comes right off of the city's levy, and it's paid for through this pool as opposed to paid for by our taxpayers. So it's huge for Maplewood. Minneapolis doesn't like this program very well because they're the major contributors, as is Bloomington. But I was happy to see an increase. If I go back, again, you can see that the trend has been that it's increasing overall, the long-term trend. So that's another good sign for the economy in the metropolitan area, and it's a good sign for Maplewood's tax levy. Just about $150,000 more this year that we were able to utilize. So all of those factors together make up the tax capacity rate. And if you look at the history there was an anomaly in 2015 having to do with some large tax petitions that took a huge amount of value off the tax base. But with the exception of that, you can see trending down. Even this year, still a slight downward movement for 2020 that we're proposing. So that's a really good sign. Probably means very little to the taxpayers because they're still going to see their tax bills going up, but it does mean that you're not using all of that capacity. You're getting some of it back by lowering the tax rate, so their taxes could be much higher. But the city has been conservative and kept the levy low. So the tax rate, and that's a really good sign that our credit analysts watch for as well. And this chart just puts it all together, all of those factors. It gets a little more complicated than this, but these are the basic factors. Excuse me. So our average annual levy increase over that time period was 3.3 per year. But the tax capacity rose 5.8% per year on average, and fiscal disparities also increased, and so that brought the tax rate down. So tax capacity and the help from this fiscal disparities increased more than the city tax levy, and that's what brings the rate down. It's a good sign. So just a quick look, Ramsey County likes to keep information for like a long, long time. And so they have this chart of market values way back to 1999, and it is kind of interesting. It shows you what the market value was. This is in billions in Ramsey County in 1999, and you can see the peak at about 2008 before everything kind of crashed. And you have to remember with market values, they're often a year or two behind because of the way the assessment process runs. So you'll see that little bit of a lag, after the recession. And you see the low point in about 2013 or so, and then just very, very slow recovery. So now in 2019, recovered past the low point since 1999, the low point in 2008, and in 2020, payable 2020, at the highest historical ever. So that's what we're seeing, and when we're seeing these increases in taxes, we're seeing a lot of increase in value. So it's a good sign that market value is increasing, but it also means that taxes are increasing.
Ms. Balseth,
Yes.
Councilmember Smith has a question.
Could we go back to the tax rate calculation?
Sure.
So we'll go back to the tax rate calculations factors. I just have a couple questions, sort of how these dollars flow. So apologies if this is a rookie question, but so we have the city tax levy. This is what we're levying on residents as far as revenue coming in.
Correct.
The way I understand tax capacity is that it's a calculation of market values of different properties, different rates of different types of properties. That tells us essentially how much could we possibly tax if we wanted to someday, which
Loosely,
we
yes.
never would do. I guess my question then is, how does fiscal disparities play into this? Is that essentially paying part of the levy so taxpayers don't have to pay it? It's not incremental dollars to the levy?
That's correct,
Okay.
Councilmember Smith and council members. So what happens is the city will certify the levy that you're seeing in the far left column, and then the county will subtract from that levy the amount of fiscal disparities that you see in that column and towards the right. And then they spread to our taxpayers. The rate is then based on that lowered levy and that tax capacity. And then what's spread to our taxpayers is that lowered amount.
So said alternatively, if we're 23.2 million and we get roughly 3.2 million, then our taxpayers would actually be paying 20 million against a $23.2
That's
million
correct.
levy.
That's correct.
Okay. So it's not incremental dollars for us.
Right.
Great.
Now,
Thank you.
the city of
Not great,
Maplewood
but
does
good to
contribute. The city of Maplewood also contributes to the pool with, commercial industrial values, but what we gain out of it is the 3.2 million.
All right, and do you know so the number you gave us before was the net?
Yeah, this is what we gain from it.
So this is the total gain?
Yeah.
But the number we had earlier in the presentation was the,
I think it was the same. As
Oh, it was
we're
the same,
talking
okay.
both, yeah, 3.1 million, 3.2 million.
We have another question, Councilmember Neblett.
Thank you, Acting Mayor. So how much are we paying into the fiscal disparities? Is that a calculation, or is this?
Yeah, I don't
that
have that
come from?
number with me. There's a certain amount that's paid in, and then it goes into a formula. But this is the dollar amount that is the gain. So we actually gain this much more than what we pay in.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, so everybody in the metropolitan area has a particular amount that they pay based on population?
Based on the commercial and industrial values, so it's commercial and industrial property, and most cities have at least some.
Okay.
Some may have none. And then those values get contributed to that pool, and Anoka County creates, by statute, there's a formula.
Okay.
And then This is what the city gains back from that. So we don't actually pay dollars into it. It's market value that goes into a pool, and then it gets spread out equally.
Got it. Okay.
City Manager Coleman, sorry.
I would just add to the answer that you got from Ms. Paulson. This is really complicated. Minnesota is known to have the most complicated tax structure in the United States. But I think this really started back when the Metropolitan Council was established, and it was a way to try to equal the playing field, because some cities just have so much more commercial industrial development than others. And so it was a way to try to equalize the metropolitan area from an economic standpoint. And it's kind of mind-boggling, but that's how we do it here in Minnesota.
And
Can I ask a follow-up question? Does it go to the infrastructure, or is it just about our tax, trying to ease the tax burden?
Correct. Theoretically, the city is able to use it for infrastructure. I mean,
Got it.
theoretically,
All
but
right.
it basically is a credit right off of the tax levy. So it's a great program. It's not completely insulated from politics. There have been times when, say, for instance,
Yes.
the Mall of America gets special legislation to be excluded so that they don't have to contribute and can, keep those dollars. That happened in a couple of years, so, but typically it,
Well, in almost
Thank
every
you.
single legislative session, we have somebody proposing to do away with this.
Sure.
Yeah.
Councilmember Smith? Okay. And I, just from my own historical perspective, which is long enough, God knows, at my very early years here, we weren't getting this kind of compensation, and a small city to our east that we surround on three sides, which shall be nameless, wasn't ponying anything in because they really didn't have anything. But then when people would come in and yell at us about taxes, oh, that place, blah, it's like, yeah, well, we pay in and they collect. So it's part of the piece that, why this is such a good thing to present this, because now we are getting some decent payback, but there have been years when we didn't, and it hasn't always played the equalizing role that it was intended to, shall we say.
Correct, and I think also local government aid is extremely complicated in political formula, and some cities basically get nothing. And so we're fortunate that after the last raise, we're getting roughly $1 million, I think. So, but it has not always been that.
No. So it probably never will be stable because it's at the whim of politicians. Councilmember Smith?
Careful, we're all one of them.
I don't think so.
The 5% that we're talking about, is that after fiscal disparities? Is that the?
Before,
It's before.
yes.
All right, so the effective increase may be less than 5% when
That's correct.
fiscal disparities is
That's
considered. Okay, thank you. And that, the $107, all of that is before fiscal disparities?
The $107 is after,
Is after?
Yeah.
Okay, so the 5%,
yeah.
5% growth is before, 107 is the real deal.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
correct.
Any other questions?
Very good
Okay.
questions.
All right. Please proceed.
So again, good sign that market values are rising, but there's been a big shift to residential. So obviously, with the 10.5% increase in the median home, there's a shift from commercial and other classes of property to residential. So I'm sure that people are enjoying the market values returning to historic levels on their homes, but their tax bills are going to show it as well.
And then there are times when it shifts the other way to commercial industrial.
Yes.
And then you will see the petitions go up
Yes.
when that happens.
Yes.
So,
And we're seeing both, kind of a double whammy this year. This is just a chart that shows the percent of certified, that means before fiscal disparities, the percent that the city has increased their levy over the years since 2010. In 2010, it was increased 4.6%. The next year, I'm sorry, not the levy, the property tax. So on the median home, the property tax, despite that the levy may have been zero in that year, the property tax increased 4.6, 9.1. And that's where you see these big peaks and valleys, because it's following market value increases and decreases, and not so much really following what the levy is. So you did see a -6 in one year and a -4 again the next year. Those, again, were, some anomalies happening in the market and with some petitions and things like that, and then a huge increase, and then bringing back down, and now we're seeing it trending back up again. So I think it's the volatility that is probably most upsetting to property taxpayers. So just to show how this works, what I did this year is a new chart. So the blue bars are the median home value, and that has been changing, up and down with the economy. I just want to point out, though, that prior to 2012, there was a different formula for calculating taxes, so I typically do not include information prior to 2012 in my charts because it doesn't compare very well. So if you can just keep that in mind and kind of look at how the median home value, went to its lowest point in 13 and 14 and then started rising again. And what the red line is with the numbers above it, that is the city tax, so Maplewood tax, property tax on the median home. So you can just see how it follows those values, more so than the levy. Your levy has been, relatively speaking, rather flat. But it just kind of shows how much impact those values have on the property taxes themselves. And I don't know if any of you saw it, but in the Star Tribune this weekend, there was an article about Minneapolis and St. Paul. It was called Cities Stuck in Stubborn Tax Trend. So with Minneapolis looking at, I think it's 5 and St. Paul 7, or it could be the other way around, % increases, and a lot of discussion, and most of it centered around comments from taxpayers, ranging from taxpayers who were frustrated with council members who didn't feel that the council members really understood their economic position. And on the other end of the spectrum, some taxpayers were not unhappy at all about the increases because they wanted to see more amenities. What I wanted to point out from it, the article touched a little bit about values rising, but it really didn't go into depth. That's usually not how these articles work. But the Ramsey County Auditor Treasurer, Chris Samuels, was quoted telling his council members on August 7th, and I'll quote, he says, "The ability of the local government agencies to impact property taxes is marginal." So what he really means by that, and I'm extrapolating this out of the context that's provided before and after, there's some discussion about market values and how some property owners are seeing double-digit market values. So the city council really has no control over that, and that impacts taxes more than your levy ever will. And then after that, they start talking about property tax levies. Most cities, local governments are reliant on property taxes and really very other small amounts of revenue sources, which is the case with Maplewood, which we've discussed on several occasions. So again, you have little flexibility when you don't have a lot of other revenue sources, when this is your major revenue source for the general fund, I think something like 75%. So that's really what he meant there in a lot of different ways. You may have to take a lot of heat for the property taxes, but it is difficult sometimes for people to understand that it's not always about spending.
Councilmember Smith has another question.
Sure.
Actually, this is a comment, and I think I appreciate what you're saying as far as the difficulty of impacting taxes and budget, and I think when we look at this, I'm going through budgeting right now in my job in the private sector, and I think there's this sort of idea that somehow the private sector is more efficient and is driven by market forces and has to meet these things, but when we talk about budget at work, we talk about merit And then we talk about everything else, merit meaning, the cost of increasing wages for our employees, right? Which is, roughly about 3% like it is here. And we talk about those two things as separate things because merit is not something we can control. We have to continue to pay our people well and retain them, and they're not under contract even here. That it's just what we have to do to keep people from quitting. And then we talk about what are the incremental things we want to fund as a business to try to grow the business. And sometimes I feel like we should do more of that here to think about, there's a merit aspect of, there's the annual increase or whatever we call it in the city side of things, right? The cost of living or whatever that might be. That's out of our hands. I mean, we're talking about a 3% levy increase one way or the other, like it or not, for that element of our budget, which is a big part of our budget. People is the biggest part of our budget. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing is when I do talk to residents about this, I really like to think about things in terms of the value of taxes versus the cost of taxes. Because people get their tax statements, it's a lot of money and it looks terrible, but when you really start to dig into it and think, well, what do you get for your money? Right? And yeah, is it $100 more this year? Is it $107 more this year? Well, we got to make those tough decisions. But on the flip side of it, do your roads get plowed before your neighbors in the big city next door do? Do you see service levels from your police department, your fire department, your EMS department at higher levels? Do you see responsiveness from public works in a different way? Like, these are things we need to talk to residents about because all of those things cost money. And I think we do a heck of a good job providing really top quality service at a pretty good price. And so I think it's important that we keep coming back to, it's not just dollars down the drain. Everybody gets things for these dollars. And if you're not happy with the services, the level of services you're getting, trust me, we get those calls. And, those are conversations we can have. But, the flip side of it is we got to do our part to also keep those services up and keep them well-funded so that we can keep them good quality. So I think that value idea is something I keep coming back to as we go through this. And I don't think we should be afraid to ask people to pay for good value. I think if we were asking people to waste money, that would be hard. But I don't think we're doing that. So I just encourage my colleagues to keep thinking about that because there's a lot of good here.
And over time, Brian and I have always tried to do the same thing, and I have actually said to people, well, which service would you like us to cut back on? And they go, well, nothing. Okay, well, what have you done to your house in the last 5 years that costs less than it did 10 years ago? I mean, you have to keep these things in perspective. And we deal out pretty good, high-quality services because we have good, high-quality people. There's an equal sign between that. So I agree with you. You get what you pay for in many cases. Thank you.
Mayor and council members, I completely agree that that is a significant challenge for Maplewood and for other cities as well, is reaching that taxpayer with that information. As good a communications efforts as we have, it still sometimes just doesn't get there. I'm going to go over this very quickly because these next two slides are old and are just kept in here as placekeepers. And the reason they're old is because the Department of Revenue still has not updated its new software system. So we weren't able to get information for 2017 or 18 or 19. So we're still waiting for them to get that updated. But this just shows, Maplewood being kind of in the middle of the pack of our peers with $877 for the average home, or for a $200,000 home, I apologize, in comparison with some of the others. And the orange being the total taxes, so just illustrating that living in Ramsey and Hennepin counties is more expensive overall. And this is, second slide, is just a comparison of our neighbors, many of whom are much smaller. So just again showing that we may be a little bit more than the middle on this one, but relatively speaking, kind of in the ballpark there. Very quickly, we've only made some minor changes to the capital improvement plan that will be presented for approval in December, adding a bucket truck It has to do with the emerald ash borer and some other things. Mr. Love would certainly be happy to answer any questions about that. And also, one of the things to point out, the construction of the fire hall still included a revenue source of actually selling the London Lane station. So we do need to keep that in mind, that we may have to bond for that, and it could put us over our bonding limit. So it's something we're going to have to watch very closely and figure out how we're actually going to maneuver that whole project. Very quickly, as I've mentioned before, we've been trying, at least since I've been here, to lower the amount of general fund reliance on the utility funds. So to make it just very simple, it is a practice to charge utility funds for overhead to reduce the general fund levy. However, sometimes the charges can be more than reasonable, and that was what I thought they were. And so we have been trying to reduce the reliance on the utility funds and try to use those funds for what they were intended for, replacing the infrastructure. We certainly can justify a certain amount of overhead, but not $800,000 into that level, pulling from the utility funds. We had it down to $590 in 2018 and had to pull it back up a little bit in 19 in order to make that 3% levy. So again, that's another thing that we're trying to correct again this year, is pull that back down. So that the 5% is helping with that as well. Financial policies, all we're really going to do is modify the debt policy again, another $50 per capita, to keep lowering that until we get it where we want it. We don't want to lower it too low and we'll be out of compliance with our own policy. But we're getting, slowly each year, we've been lowering $50 per capita, and we'll finally get it down to where we want, somewhere in that area of 1,000 maybe. Some other GASB requirements that we will be including, and that's about it. So all we'd really be looking for from here on out, in September, we're going to be bringing you the preliminary levy, just looking for a consensus from the council that you're in agreement with what we'll be presenting, and any other kind of policy decisions that have arisen through the course of these presentations. I'd certainly like to hear about them now so that we can be prepared to present the final preliminary levy in September.
Any questions or comments for Ms. Paulseth? Councilmember Knudsen.
Thank you, Acting Mayor. Just a quick question. I think you had said earlier that as property values go up, taxes go up. Is it? And I'm trying to figure out how that works, because you set a budget first and you've got some guardrails around your debt per capita. So I don't understand how that would, in other words, the proportion of taxes would change relative to your home value, but the total taxes were based on budget and need. Am I correct?
Correct, yes. So the total taxes are based strictly on what the city levies. So one of the falsities about property taxes that if your values go up, that means that the city gets more money, and that's not true. It's just shifting from one class to another. So
that's my question.
Typically, if your home value goes up, your taxes are probably going to go up, but it just depends on the other factors.
Thank you.
Anything else? Well, at the risk of making enemies, what's new with that with me? I do caution everybody, when you do get your tax statement, that the other entity that has a tendency to take a fair amount and doesn't get questioned nearly often enough is the county. So I caution everybody to look. And the reason I bring that up now is because it's going to happen when the tax statements are out and people are tearing their hair. And just because we happen to be where we are on the form doesn't make us the worst in the world. And the other thing is, there have been some issues at the county this year where they have spent horrendous amounts of money on things that people ought to be aware of. So I encourage everybody to question your county people as well. Just a caution. And now,
Thank you.
It's the community development show. Da-da-da-da-da-da. A holdover from last time by popular demand.
Yes.
Do you want to chew this one up too, City Manager? Come on.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the City Council. in preparation for the 2020 budget, all the departments have been asked to talk to you a little bit about their departments, some of their accomplishments, and discuss the opportunities that they see ahead, and also challenges and goals for the next year. So our relatively new Community Development Director, Jeff Thompson, is going to give you such a presentation tonight.
Thank you, Acting Mayor, members of the council. I'm just glad my topip is less complicated than the Minnesota property tax system, but I guess we'll see.
Yes.
So thank you for the opportunity just to walk through the Community Development Department. It was a good exercise for me as well, just to become more familiar with community development as I kind of continue my onboarding with everything that's going on in Maplewood. So I'm so new, I'm not even included in our department picture yet, so we'll work on that.
You should have gotten just a little head photoshopped in
Just
there.
Photoshop myself in, like in the foreground or something, or maybe in the trees in the back. So this is just a list of services that the Community Development Department provides. A lot of them you're probably familiar with because some of the planning and economic development and zoning stuff kind of comes into your agendas and in this room quite commonly. But there are a lot of services that we provide in development and economic development that are kind of more behind the scenes, day-to-day operations piece that are less public here in the council chambers, but certainly very active in the community on kind of a day-to-day basis. But generally, we're a department that provides external services to the community on anything around community and economic development, mostly related to kind of planning for that, as well as kind of growth and construction. Just on the people piece, I think, that's one thing that's kind of key to community development is how we provide service to the community, to both businesses and residents. And one thing that I've recognized kind of within the staff in the department is everyone kind of recognizes this kind of key core service that we provide, and is kind of dedicated to providing good public service. Sometimes I have to describe a lot just in my personal life, kind of what somebody in community development does, because it's kind of a pretty general term. So I always kind of point to projects as examples, and how we kind of point from things from the inception of an idea to kind of seeing that through the creation of that project, and ultimately facilitate kind of its ultimate construction. I think the Frost English development is a great example of that. A neighborhood study that was adopted by the city back in 2007, kind of anticipating public and private investment. The city's invested a lot of money in public infrastructure, in roads and streets, working with Public Works, and purchasing property, and then ultimately bringing it through the council process on the development application with some tax increment financing. And then it's done here, but the public actually hasn't seen anything, so that's a good project that points that after it's kind of done here and moves along, that the department, half the other department is focused on making those projects happen. I've benefited from my first couple months that we've done our business outreach. We're doing our annual kind of outreach to the businesses that are located in Maplewood. I've had a lot of takeaways, but I think one key takeaway that I've had is one of the questions we ask is, what's in the last year? Have you talked to anybody at the city, or have you had any kind of contact with city staff? And a lot of times we hear police or public safety officials, but actually the most common answer we've received that I've heard is our inspection staff, because a lot of the businesses are making improvements and reinvesting in their facilities, and that involves our inspection staff. And so it's important to remember they're key ambassadors to kind of the city and our message, but also they're a good inroad to our local businesses because they're out there on a day-to-day basis. Aside from working with the businesses, we work with other city departments. I can't think of a function that's more critical to work with all departments that are within the city organization. Something unique about community development is that we also work with a lot of boards and commissions here at the city. These are the 4 boards and advisory boards and commissions that we work with on a regular basis. 3 of the 4 meet monthly, and then the head C, the Housing and Economic Development, is currently meeting quarterly. So a key function is working with these advisory boards to vet projects that come forward, kind of spend more time on projects than the council can because you're so focused on the larger city operations. They can kind of dig into the details, vet some of those issues, a key forum for public input, and then ultimately bringing their recommendations to the council. This is our mission statement. Our general focus is to protect public health, safety, and welfare. We're guiding future growth and construction, focused on enhancing economic development, conserving natural resources, and acknowledges that we are guided by the larger 2040 comprehensive plan. When I was looking at this, I think it's a good mission statement. I think we'll look at kind of adding or tweaking to it, because I think it focuses on our regulatory approaches. But I think we could also incorporate some of our kind of the resource partner participants that our department also provides in kind of proactive community and economic development. So the department has been busy for the past year. This is kind of a highlight of our key accomplishments in 2019. Again, I just focus on the new things, not necessarily all the things that happen on a day-to-day basis. So we're wrapping up the 2040 comprehensive plan. I just saw the Met Council meeting agenda for Wednesday night, where we are scheduled for the final approval from the Met Council, which is great news after 2 years of work from Maplewood. And assuming that goes well, we'll bring that back into September for the council's adoption. The North End Vision Study caught up to the comp plan. So it was an idea kind of that came out of the comp plan, community engagement, but that will also be before you in adoption. The draft is done, the Planning Commission saw it next week, so that'll be before you in September as well. As I mentioned, we're continuing our annual kind of business outreach, going to reach any size business that will let us in the door to have a conversation about what's new in their business, what issues they're facing, let them know that we're a resource. We can connect people to other resources or other organizations, but also just to make sure that they know that the face in City Hall they can call if any issue should come up. So council knows we've been negotiating the trash and recycling contracts. That's a big deal, and hope to have those wrapped up soon. And then Mike Martin is the department's contact on our transit planning projects from a community development standpoint. So those lines impact, station areas and future development. He's engaged on both Gold Line and Rush Line. The Gladstone, we closed on another property in the Gladstone neighborhood, the Moose Lodge. So we'll continue to work on the future development of that site. The EDA restructuring will now kind of move into, now that the council's adopted that, focusing on kind of the organizational meetings that need to happen, but also starting to establish some kind of priorities for what the EDA should be working on in the next year. We continue our work with St. Paul and Roseville on the Rice-Larpenteur Alliance. Just had a meeting today where they're talking about a lot of the success stories that they've shared in the last year. They had a block party last week ago that was successful. Great feedback on that. And then looking into moving that model into the long-term alliance and what this financial and kind of structure of the organization will look like. And then lastly, we are again awarded the Step 5, the highest rating you can get from the Minnesota Green Cities program. So we were able to achieve it again, and Mr. Funk and Mr. Knutson were able to get that award at the league conference.
A mystery guest.
Sorry. He did not tell me to bring that up at tonight's meeting, I swear. You've talked, so these are our opportunities and challenges for next year. The council, as part of your budget, has talked a lot about the rental housing program. That's a program that will ultimately kind of live in community development, so we'll administer the license program. We'll focus on the housing inspection side of it, working with the public safety department as well, police and fire on kind of the public safety components of the program. I have to bring up the implementation of the comp plan in the North End Vision. I know it's like, here's the plan, good, let's go do it. And that's a great idea. We 100% agree with you, but that takes next steps. And so we'll be moving into then adopting the zoning regulations and looking at, as part of the EDA, our strategies on trying to marketing these areas to incentivize the development that those vision plans are looking for. Again, on economic development, focusing on the Gladstone and the property we own there, as well as the Rush Line project, and continuing our investment in Rice and Larpenteur, both from just a resource and partnership perspective. And then lastly, on opportunities is technology. I'll talk about this a little bit on the next slide. On our efficiencies, so I just focused on two. One is some of the more technology-based community engagement tools we've used. Social Pinpoint with our comp plan and utilizing the city's poll call service. And then we have a strong focus right now on kind of getting us to the finish line of our productivity and customer service improvements. And Excella and Bluebeam are our kind of our facing programs for inspections and licensing. So the goal is to make it a more user-friendly experience. People can apply for certain licenses and permits online and facilitate a customer service experience, and significantly help us on the back end on internal efficiencies of process, essentially. And then we are always looking for partnerships, we recognize that we cannot provide all possible economic and community development services within Maplewood. So looking to, for example, utilize the St. Paul Area Chamber on our partnerships on the Maplewood Business Council, the Rice-Larpenter Alliance. Ramsey County has a lot of programs they're launching with economic development to see that we don't have to do everything in-house. Having good relationships with these agencies will help us accomplish those tasks as well. And then lastly, I just put our goals into four simple categories, and that's first, that because the only thing we do is provide service to the community, that we need to lead with exceptional customer service, and kind of everything we do needs to be viewed through that lens. Because community is the most important thing we also do in community development, making sure that we are engaging the community, and that's from every level of the service we do to make sure that we're talking to the people that we serve, both businesses and residents, to make sure that we're doing it and we're proactive to what their needs are. Thirdly, again, just focusing on proactively seeking that redevelopment. We have some ambitious plans with the comp plan, with the North End Vision Plan, that's going to take a lot of getting our message out to people that know about us and some people that don't know about us to make sure that we're moving those plans forward and making sure those projects happen. And then lastly, building and leveraging those partnerships and expanding on those to the extent that they help us accomplish some of the big things that we're trying to do. So that's a lot, but with that, Acting Mayor, Council, I'm happy to answer any questions or take any comments or feedback you have.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions or comments from Mr. Thompson? What? You have nothing to say, Mr. Smith? Is that it? Okay. I think you're off the hook. I think nobody's going to ask a question right now. But they might, think about it a while.
If it's about fiscal disparities, I'll bring Ms. Paulson back.
Thank you so much for the presentation.
I understand what he's talking about.
Ah, got it. Okay. With that, I will close this City Council Manager Workshop at 7 o'clock. We will resume at 7:05.